And welcome to another edition of our treatment of the International Sunday School lesson. Today's lesson is entitled Love That Intercedes. And it's taken from 1 Samuel 19th chapter, verses 1 through 7. And it's for October the 3rd, 2020, fall quarter, lesson number 5. Now, a little background information. This story is about the friendship between Jonathan and Jonathan and David, before David was King David. And I have to give you a little bit of background information and bring you up to speed in case you have forgotten any of the story about David. If you remember back to your reading the Old Testament, God had told Samuel that King Saul was being rejected. So God sent Samuel to go anoint a new king. And he goes to David's house, and David being the one of the younger sons of the house, he was left to be the last person that Samuel would see that day. And God spoke to him and said, "This is the one to anoint as king." So Samuel secretly anointed David, young David, as king. Now, King Saul, during this time frame, was beginning to have these fits, these rages, where he would more or less go out of his mind. And David, because he was such a good harpist and songwriter, was brought into the palace to play music to calm King Saul. And so David had beginning to have a relationship with the family of Saul. Now, as time went on, David's brothers were brought into the warfare with the Philistines. And you remember the story of the giant Goliath, as he stood and mocked the army of God. And young David said, "Who is this person to mock our God?" And young David took his slingshot and went out and faced the giant Goliath and killed him. So David was beginning to get a reputation as a hero. And we know that David married Saul's daughter, Michal, and began to have connections, more and more connections, with the royal family. And David began to go out into warfare in fighting with the Philistines. And he had begun to grow more and more in popularity. And Saul, being the narcissist that he was, it really irked him, especially like, for example, when he heard the people chanting and singing in the streets that Saul had killed his thousands and David had killed his tens of thousands. And so Saul became extremely jealous of young David. And there were several times where he tried to kill David in his fits of rage. And then, of course, we know that Saul would also calm down because these were the seizures where demons would come and fill his head with all this hateful stuff. And so David was in a very precarious position as he began to be close to the royal family. He was married to one of Saul's children, and he began to have an extremely close friendship with another one of Saul's children, and that was Jonathan. So Saul had decided that he was going to go ahead and kill David because he was afraid that David would be taking over the kingdom from him, where he was gaining in popularity more and more each day. Okay, 1 Samuel 19:1. Saul told his son Jonathan and all the attendants to kill David. But Jonathan had taken a great liking to David. So here we see here where Saul decides that he's not going to kill David himself. He's going to direct his son and his servants to kill David. Now, attendance is a little bit hard for us to really get a good grasp of what this is talking about, because in our modern thinking, you might be tempted to consider attendant to be someone who's serving food or fetching the horses or that kind of thing. But this actually, in the original language, attendants, I mean, they could have been the generals, the executives inside of the royal court. And more than likely, that's who Saul was talking to when he said this. Okay? Now, 1 Samuel 19:2 and 3, and warned him, my father Saul is looking for a chance to kill you. Be on your guard tomorrow morning. Go into hiding and stay there. I will go out and stand with my father in the field where you are. I'll speak to him about you and will tell you what I find out. Now we see here how the friendship, the close friendship that Jonathan has with David. Now looking at it in just the natural view, Jonathan was the heir of Saul. And it was beginning to be obvious that David was a very likely candidate to be drafted as the next king of Israel. So, looking at it in just a selfish standpoint, Jonathan would have had a selfish reason to try to do David in. But because Jonathan was such a good friend and had a desire to fulfill the obligation and the plan of God in his life. He warned David how that his father had plans to kill him. And he told David that he would try to change his father's mind, and he would let David know how it went, so David could adjust his actions accordingly. Now, Jonathan spoke well of David to Saul his father, and said to him, "Let not the king do wrong to his servant David. He has not wronged you, and what he has done has benefited you greatly." So, at this point in time, David's service to King Saul had been significant. You know by reading in the book of Samuel how that Saul had been at constant war with the Philistines, and they were very strong and an able adversary to the people of Israel. And David had been an active participant in fighting for the people of Israel, in fighting for the kingdom of Saul, and had won many battles. So Saul had benefited, had a significant benefit to those actions of David. And Jonathan is pointing out to his dad all of the good things that David had done to benefit the kingdom. And he's pointing out that you should not reward evil for good. And we also, too, as individuals, as we go through our lives, we need to make note of how David's good, righteous actions, how they benefited David. When we do right, there is a reward for doing right. And see, if David had not been a faithful servant and had not been living up to his obligations, then Jonathan would not have been able to point this out. And we also, too, throughout this whole entire story of David in the house of Saul, it's important to note that David was not sneaky, he was not conniving, he was not trying to do them in. He, at every multiple positions of doing them all in, David withheld himself from doing that. And because of his righteousness, You cannot lay a claim of David stealing the throne from Saul and his children. It was truly an act of God that moved the kingdom from the house of Saul to the house of David. Okay? Now, 1 Samuel 19:5, he took his life in his hands when he killed the Philistine. The Lord won a great victory for all Israel, and you saw it and were glad. Why then would you do wrong to an innocent man like David by killing him for no reason? Now we see here how Jonathan made an extremely valid defense of David. The truth mattered to Jonathan. Being right mattered to Jonathan. Being loyal to his friend mattered to Jonathan. So we see the righteousness that Jonathan displayed at this moment. We also, too, make note and recognize that the fact that David risked his life and by faith went out to that field and faced Goliath and won that great victory for the people of God. And that he had conducted himself innocently on all matters as he dealt with the house of Saul. He had been honorable in how he had dealt with Saul on every turn. And by the fact that David lived a righteous life, Jonathan was able to make that defense. Now, where people get confused at times, they will go out and do wrong, and then when bad things happen, they have no defense. We need to do right. We need to live right. We need to be honorable in the way that we deal with people. If you're ranting and raving at people, and this is obnoxious as you can possibly be, and harsh and mean-spirited to people, if you go into a business dealings with someone and you bold-faced lie to them and rook them into something and take advantage of them, and when they deal with you harshly, that is not Christian persecution. That's because you did not do the right thing toward that other person. If we suffer because we've done wrong, that has got nothing to do with Christian persecution. And yet, there are times where people will try to make out like it's persecution. If you're not doing your job and your boss comes by and chews you out for it, that's not persecution. That is simply you are not doing your job and your boss chewed you out. If you're not wearing your seatbelt and the policeman stops you for not wearing a seatbelt, they're not persecuting you. You broke the law. So we need to understand and be sensitive to the fact that we need to be doing the right thing. Now, 1 Samuel 19:6, Saul listened to Jonathan and took this oath: as surely as the Lord lives, David will not be put to death. Now, in all likelihood, by all indications, at this moment that Saul said that, he meant that. And there was a period of sanity on Saul's part. He eased up. He gave David a period of rest from the attack. And David got to enjoy that. 1 Samuel 19:7. So Jonathan called David and told him the whole conversation. He brought him to Saul, and David was with Saul as before. So we see here how there was a recess, a letting up of the onslaught from King Saul toward David. So David used that period of time to help the people of God and to help put the Philistines in their place and to do the things that God would have him to do at that time period. Okay. Now, some concluding thoughts. I just want to reiterate some of the things that we've said for today's lesson. First off, we need to be attentive to doing the things that are right. If you do the right thing, more often than not, good things come to you. If you're doing the wrong thing, more often than not, in the natural, bad things happen. Now, that's not always the case. Now, sometimes you can be doing the right thing and have hard times come. I think it's because they come. But generally speaking, if you're honorable and you're loyal and you do the right things, there are natural rewards for that. If every time your boss comes by and looks at you, you're working, generally you keep a job longer than someone that every time the boss comes by, you're sitting there chit-chatting and not doing your job. If you pay your bills on time to the best of your ability, chances are when you need credit, you're able to get credit. If you deadbeat everybody every chance you get, chances are you don't get credit. So we need to go about our lives as best as we possibly can, being as honorable and as faithful and as loyal as we possibly can be. Well, friends, good Lord willing, I'll be back with you next weekend. And welcome to